The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield of Daniel's car as he navigated the dimly lit streets of the city. It had been a slow night for rides, and the steady rhythm of the wipers was beginning to lull him into a state of drowsy monotony. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, 11:47 p.m. He debated calling it a night when the ping of a new ride request jolted him awake. The pickup location wasn't far, just off an older part of town Daniel usually avoided. The streets there were narrow, lined with abandoned storefronts and flickering streetlights. But a ride was a ride, and he needed the money. He arrived at the pin and scanned the street. It was deserted. Rain cascaded off the awnings of the few remaining shops, and the glow of a distant neon sign barely illuminated the cracked pavement. He double-checked the app. Passenger Oliver. Destination TBD. TBD, that was unusual. Most riders entered their destination up front. He hesitated, then rolled down his window, peering into the shadows. "Hello? Oliver?" A figure emerged from the alleyway, moving slowly but deliberately. The man wore a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded most of his face from the rain. He stopped by the passenger's side, opened the door, and slid in without a word. The interior of the car immediately felt colder. Daniel glanced at his passenger, who sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees. The man didn't remove his hat or coat, and his face remained obscured in the dim light. Oliver?" Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. The man nodded once. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. "Thank you for picking me up." "No problem," Daniel replied, though his nerves prickled. "Where are you headed?" Oliver turned his head slightly, his face still hidden in shadow. "I'll let you know when we're close." Daniel frowned. "The app needs an address. Can you give me a general area?" Oliver's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Just drive. I'll guide you." Against his better judgment, Daniel put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The rain continued to fall, the rhythmic thud of droplets against the roof the only sound as the car rolled through the empty streets. Minutes passed, and Oliver remained silent. Daniel tried to focus on the road, but his unease grew with each passing block. Something about the man felt wrong. He finally broke the silence. "Busy night for you?" Oliver tilted his head as if considering the question. "Not as busy as yours, Daniel." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. "How do you know my name?" Oliver chuckled softly, the sound low and unsettling. "You introduced yourself when you signed up for the app. Drivers are easy to look up." "Right," Daniel said, though he couldn't recall ever introducing himself to a passenger. He tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the GPS display. "So, still no destination?" Oliver leaned forward slightly. "Turn left, up ahead." Daniel hesitated, but the turn signal clicked on almost instinctively. The car entered a darker, narrower street lined with old brownstones and leafless trees swaying in the wind. It wasn't a part of town he recognized. "You live around here?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. "No," Oliver replied simply. "But you've been here before." Daniel's pulse quickened. "I don't think so." Oliver chuckled again, this time with a sharp edge. "You'd be surprised how much we forget." Daniel glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but Oliver's face remained obscured. The rain outside blurred the windows, the streetlights casting distorted shadows on the dashboard. "You're going to want to turn right at the next intersection," Oliver said, his tone calm but commanding. Daniel wanted to ask why, wanted to demand answers, but his mouth felt dry, and his hands moved almost on their own. He turned the wheel, and the car rolled onto another unfamiliar street. They drove in silence for a while longer. The further they went, the fewer lights there were. The road became uneven, the potholes jolting the car as the rain intensified. Daniel's unease turned to outright fear. "I'm going to need an address," he said firmly, his voice shaking slightly. "I can't just keep driving aimlessly." Oliver finally looked up, his shadowed gaze meeting Daniel's in the mirror. "Not aimlessly, Daniel. You're going home." Daniel's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? This isn't my neighborhood." "Not the one you live in now," Oliver said softly, "but the one you left behind." Daniel slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the slick road. "That's it. Ride's over. You can get out." Oliver didn't move. He simply sat there, his presence heavy and unyielding. "You're not ready to stop yet. I said get out," Daniel repeated, his voice rising. Oliver leaned back in his seat, his hands resting casually on his knees. "You've already started the journey, Daniel. You can't stop it now." The dashboard clock blinked, 12:12 a.m. Daniel's stomach dropped. The numbers on the clock weren't moving, frozen in place despite the seconds ticking by in his head. "What the hell?" Daniel whispered, glancing at the clock and then at Oliver. "You'll understand soon enough," Oliver said, his voice almost soothing. "But first, we have a few more stops to make." Before Daniel could respond, the GPS on his phone beeped. The map updated itself, a red pin marking a new destination. "Proceed to your next stop," the voice chirped cheerfully. Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. He hadn't entered anything, his hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. "Drive, Daniel," Oliver said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's time to remember." With a shaking breath, Daniel put the car back in drive. The rain seemed to fall harder, the world outside growing darker as the car moved toward its mysterious destination. And deep down, Daniel knew. This wasn't just a ride. It was the beginning of something far more terrifying. The rhythmic thud of rain against the windshield filled the silence as Daniel drove. His eyes darted between the GPS and the shadowy figure seated behind him. Oliver hadn't said a word since the last command, but his presence weighed heavily on the car. The pin on the GPS glowed red, marking an address that Daniel didn't recognize. The directions led them deeper into the outskirts of the city, where the buildings became sparse and the streetlights flickered inconsistently. Daniel's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter. This can't be right," he muttered. "There's nothing out here." Oliver finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "You'll see soon enough. Keep driving." Daniel wanted to argue, to pull over and demand an explanation, but something about Oliver, his stillness, his calm authority, kept him moving. Against every instinct screaming at him to stop, he pressed on. As they neared the destination, the GPS instructed him to turn down a narrow dirt road. The headlights illuminated the path, the rain turning the ground into thick mud. Trees lined both sides, their gnarled branches arching overhead like skeletal hands. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror. Oliver was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the brim of his hat. "This doesn't make any sense," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "Why would anyone live out here?" Oliver turned his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Who said this was about someone else?" Daniel's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" "You'll remember soon," Oliver replied cryptically. The car jostled as the road became rougher, the tires struggling to grip the muddy surface. The headlights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. Daniel's heart raced as the GPS announced, "You have arrived." He stopped the car, his breathing shallow as he stared ahead. The headlights illuminated an old, crumbling house at the end of the path. Its windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged as if it had been abandoned for years. The overgrown yard was littered with debris, and the faint outline of a rusted swing set swayed in the wind. Daniel frowned. Something about the house felt disturbingly familiar. "This can't be right," he said again, more to himself than Oliver. Oliver leaned forward slightly, his presence suddenly more commanding. "Go inside." "No," Daniel said firmly, gripping the wheel tighter. "I'm not going in there." Oliver's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "You have to." Daniel turned to face him, his fear bubbling into anger. "Listen, I don't know what this is or who you are, but I'm done. Get out of my car." Oliver's shadowed face tilted, his voice unshaken. "You brought me here, Daniel. You accepted the ride." "I didn't know." Daniel stopped himself, realizing the futility of arguing. His hand hovered over the door handle, unsure whether he wanted to get out or drive away. Oliver sat back, his tone softening. "You've been running from this place for years. It's time to stop." Daniel froze. The words cut through him like a blade. He didn't know how or why, but Oliver was right. He had been running. The house with its sagging roof and boarded windows was more than familiar. It was tied to something he'd spent his whole life trying to forget. He swallowed hard. "How do you know about this?" Oliver didn't answer. He simply gestured toward the house, his gloved hand pointing to the warped front door. Daniel stepped out of the car reluctantly, the rain drenching him almost immediately. He turned to see Oliver still seated inside, watching him through the window. "Aren't you coming?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "This is your journey," Oliver said. "You have to take the next step alone." Daniel wanted to argue, but his feet carried him forward. The squelch of mud under his boots was deafening in the otherwise silent night. The house loomed larger with each step, its decayed structure seeming to breathe with the wind. When he reached the porch, he hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond impenetrable. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed it open, the creak echoing unnaturally. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the scent of damp wood and decay. His flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and puddles of water from a leaking roof. But what caught his attention was a single chair in the center of the room, perfectly intact, as if untouched by time. On it sat a small leather-bound notebook. Daniel approached cautiously, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. His hand trembled as he reached for the notebook, its surface worn and cracked. When he opened it, his breath caught. The pages were filled with entries in his own handwriting. "July 15th. I can't take it anymore. The silence is too loud here. It's like the house itself is watching me. July 18th. I saw something in the woods again. A man in a black coat. He didn't say anything, just stood there. July 20th. I'm leaving. I can't stay here any longer. But I know it won't let me go." Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't remember writing any of this, but the words struck a chord deep within him. The memories began to surface, fragments flashing through his mind, running through the woods as a child, the cold weight of the house pressing down on him, and the feeling that he was never truly alone. A sound broke his trance, a faint creak coming from upstairs. His flashlight snapped toward the staircase, but the beam revealed nothing. Still, the air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. "Daniel?" The whisper was faint but unmistakable. His flashlight shook in his hand as he turned toward the voice. At the top of the stairs, partially obscured by shadow, stood the man in the black coat. Daniel's knees nearly buckled as his fear gave way to sheer disbelief. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The man tilted his head, his voice low and deliberate. "You came back." The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the man was gone. Daniel's breathing quickened. He dropped the notebook and stumbled backward, tripping over a broken chair. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. When he burst outside, the rain hit him like a wall, but the car was gone. The dirt road stretched into darkness, the headlights nowhere to be seen. He was alone, or so he thought. Daniel stood frozen in the rain, his chest heaving as he stared at the empty road where his car should have been. The headlights, the engine's comforting hum, everything was gone. The only sound was the relentless downpour and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. He turned back toward the house. Its silhouette loomed larger now, more menacing. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where could he go? The road stretched into endless darkness, and the house, no matter how foreboding, was the only refuge from the storm. The voice replayed in his mind. "You came back." He swallowed hard and stepped back onto the sagging porch. The door he had left ajar creaked softly in the wind, as if inviting him back inside. His flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling to penetrate the suffocating gloom. He gripped it tightly and stepped through the threshold. The air inside the house was colder than before, almost icy. Daniel's breaths came out in short, visible puffs as he moved cautiously through the decayed interior. The notebook lay where he had dropped it, open to the same page filled with his handwriting. Entries he didn't remember writing. He crouched down and picked it up again, his fingers trembling. The words blurred for a moment before snapping into focus. July 23rd. The man is here again. He doesn't speak, but I can feel him watching. I don't know how much longer I can stay. July 26th. I tried to leave. The road just loops back to the house. It won't let me go. Daniel's grip tightened on the notebook. The entries weren't just describing his past, they were mirroring his present. He looked around the room, his flashlight illuminating broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the cracked windows that seemed to breathe with the wind. Everything felt alive, watching, waiting. A sound broke the silence, a soft thud like footsteps on the floor above him. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response. He hesitated, then moved toward the staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, the sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. The air grew colder as he ascended, the flashlight beam shaking as he swept it across the darkened hallway. The second floor was worse. The walls were covered in strange dark stains that spread like veins, pulsating faintly in the light. Doors lined the hallway, most of them ajar, revealing empty, decayed rooms. At the end of the hall, a single door stood closed. Daniel approached it slowly, every step sending a jolt of dread through his body. The air seemed thicker here, each breath harder to take. He reached out, his hand trembling as he gripped the doorknob. The second his fingers touched the metal, the whispering started. Faint at first, then louder, overlapping voices that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. He recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by deafening silence. Daniel's breaths came fast and shallow as he stood frozen, staring at the door. Then, from behind him came a single word. "Daniel." He spun around, the flashlight shaking wildly. The hallway was empty, the doors to the other rooms still ajar, but the voice had been unmistakable. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice breaking. No response. He turned back to the door at the end of the hall. This time he didn't hesitate. He twisted the knob and pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a single object in the center. An old mirror. Its frame was ornate, covered in tarnished silver carvings of twisting vines and faces too weathered to discern. The glass was cracked, its surface distorted, but it reflected the room perfectly, or so it seemed. Daniel stepped closer, the flashlight illuminating his reflection. He looked pale, gaunt, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes locked on the cracks in the mirror, which seemed to spread as he stared at them. Then, in the reflection, he saw a movement behind him. He spun around, the flashlight's beam sweeping the room. Nothing. When he turned back to the mirror, his reflection was gone. His heart stopped. He stared at the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The room in the mirror was the same, but he wasn't in it. Then, from deep within the house, came the sound of the front door slamming shut. Daniel bolted out of the room, the notebook clutched tightly in one hand and the flashlight in the other. He ran down the hallway, the whispers rising again, louder this time, more insistent. The walls seemed to close in around him, the dark stains pulsing like they were alive. When he reached the staircase, he froze. The man in the black coat stood at the bottom, his face still obscured by shadow. "You shouldn't have come back," the man said, his voice calm and deliberate. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what you left behind." Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't even remember this place." The man's shadow seemed to grow, stretching across the floor and up the walls. "You will." The house groaned, the floor beneath Daniel's feet trembling. The whispers grew deafening, and the walls seemed to ripple, like they were trying to swallow him whole. Daniel turned and ran back into the hallway, desperate to escape. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. But no matter how far he ran, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors repeating over and over like a looping nightmare. Finally, he stopped, his chest heaving as he leaned against the wall. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. "You can't run from yourself," the man's voice echoed, distant but clear. "It's time to face the truth." Daniel sank to the floor, his mind racing. The house wasn't just a place, it was something more, something tied to him. And if he wanted to escape, he would have to confront whatever it was that had been waiting for him all these years. Daniel's body trembled as he pressed himself against the hallway wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers had subsided, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls like mocking specters. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You can't run from yourself. It's time to face the truth." "What truth?" Daniel whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. His hands tightened around the notebook, the leather cover slick with sweat. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, its walls warped and uneven. Doors that had once been ajar were now shut, each one seemingly daring him to open it. He glanced back the way he had come, but the staircase was gone. The house was shifting, reshaping itself around him. Daniel stood, his legs weak but determined. If the house wanted him to face something, he couldn't keep running. He approached the nearest door, his flashlight trembling as he reached for the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A twin bed sat against the wall, its faded blue blanket neatly tucked. Toys were scattered across the floor, action figures, a plastic truck, a stuffed bear missing one eye. Daniel's heart sank. The room was achingly familiar. He stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. His flashlight landed on a framed photograph sitting on the nightstand. It showed a young boy, no older than 6, smiling broadly as he held the same stuffed bear that now lay on the floor. Daniel picked up the photo, his hands shaking. The boy was him. Memories began to surface, fragments of laughter, the warmth of a summer afternoon, the sound of his mother's voice calling him to dinner. But the warmth was quickly replaced by a chill as darker images crept in, shouting, tears, and the suffocating weight of fear. He set the photo down and turned toward the bed. Something was wrong. The blanket shifted, as though something beneath it was moving. "Hello?" Daniel's voice cracked as he approached. The blanket bulged slightly, then fell still. His heart pounded as he reached out, gripping the edge of the fabric. With a deep breath, he yanked it back. The bed was empty. The room seemed to exhale, the air growing colder. The toys on the floor began to rattle, their movements slow at first, but growing more violent. The one-eyed bear rolled toward him, stopping at his feet. A voice whispered from behind him. "Why did you leave?" Daniel spun around. The flashlight beam cutting through the room, but no one was there. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The toys stopped moving. The silence was deafening. He backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart raced as he leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. The hallway stretched before him again, the doors now slightly ajar, as though inviting him to continue. "You have to face it, Daniel." The man's voice was closer this time. Daniel whipped around, but the hallway was empty. "Face what?" Daniel shouted, his frustration boiling over. "What do you want me to see?" The walls groaned in response, the plaster cracking and peeling as though the house itself was alive. Another door at the far end of the hallway creaked open, revealing a faint glow. Daniel hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. The notebook in his hand felt heavier now, the weight of its pages dragging him forward. He walked toward the open door, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. The room beyond was larger than it should have been, impossibly vast. The walls were covered in mirrors, their surfaces cracked and distorted, reflecting twisted versions of the room and of Daniel himself. In the center stood a single chair, identical to the one downstairs, and sitting on it was the man in the black coat. "You're finally ready," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. Daniel stopped in the doorway, his flashlight aimed at the figure. "Ready for what?" The man gestured to the mirrors. "To remember." "I don't want to remember," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I don't even know why I'm here." The man tilted his head, the shadows around him shifting. "You've been running from this place your entire life, Daniel, from what happened here. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you close your eyes." Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man leaned forward slightly. "Then look." The mirrors around the room began to shimmer, the cracks glowing faintly as images appeared within them. Daniel's reflection vanished, replaced by scenes from his past, moments he had buried deep within himself. One mirror showed a young boy, him, hiding under a table, his hands pressed over his ears as muffled shouting filled the air. Another mirror showed the same boy running through the woods, his face streaked with tears, clutching the one-eyed bear. A third mirror showed him standing in this very house, older now, staring at the door to the child's bedroom, his face pale with fear. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." "It's real, Daniel," the man said, "and it's time to stop hiding." The mirrors began to shift again, the images dissolving into darkness. The glow in the cracks grew brighter, and the man stood, his presence towering. "You left something behind in this house," the man said, his voice echoing. "Something you've tried to forget, but it's still here, waiting for you." Daniel shook his head, his breaths coming in short gasps. "I don't understand. What did I leave behind?" The man stepped closer, his face still obscured by the shadows. "Your guilt." The room trembled, the mirrors shattering one by one. The sound was deafening, shards flying in every direction but vanishing before they could touch him. Daniel covered his ears, dropping the flashlight as the light from the cracks consumed the room. When the chaos subsided, the room was empty. No mirrors, no chair, no man in the black coat. Only Daniel, standing alone, and the faint sound of a child's voice whispering from the darkness, "Why didn't you come back?" Daniel fell to his knees, the weight of the question crushing him. He didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew he couldn't run any longer. The house wouldn't let him. The house seemed to close in around Daniel as the whisper lingered in the air. "Why didn't you come back?" The words echoed through his mind, their weight suffocating. He knelt on the cold floor, gripping the notebook like a lifeline, his breaths shallow and uneven. The walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. He glanced around the empty room, expecting the man in the black coat to reappear, but there was only silence. Only him. And then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they came from the hallway beyond the door. Daniel forced himself to his feet, his body trembling, and turned toward the sound. The flashlight lay at his feet, flickering weakly, its light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The footsteps paused, and for a moment the house was deathly still. Then a voice, soft, fragile, and unmistakably that of a child, floated through the air. "You left me." Daniel's chest tightened. No, I didn't," he stammered, backing toward the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about." The voice didn't respond, but the footsteps resumed, louder this time, moving closer. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he pressed himself against the wall, clutching the notebook as if it could protect him. The doorway darkened, and a small figure appeared. It was a boy, no older than 6, dressed in a faded blue shirt and jeans, his hair damp as though he had just stepped out into the rain. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with something that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, sadness mixed with accusation. Daniel's mouth went dry. Who are you?" The boy tilted his head, the corners of his lips trembling as if he were about to cry. "You don't remember me?" Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. The boy looked familiar, painfully so, but the memories were fragmented, just out of reach. "You left me," the boy said again, his voice breaking. "You said you'd come back, but you never did." Daniel shook his head, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to." The boy took a step closer, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "You promised." The word hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. A memory surged forward, sharp and unrelenting. Him, much younger, standing at the edge of the woods behind the house. The boy was there crying, clutching the one-eyed bear. I couldn't," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was scared." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but his expression hardened. "You left me with him." Daniel's breath caught. "With who?" The house groaned, the walls trembling as if in response. The boy pointed past Daniel toward the empty room where the mirrors had once stood. "Him." Daniel turned slowly, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the man in the black coat. The man's presence filled the room like a void, sucking the air out of the space. He stood perfectly still, his face obscured by shadow as always, but his voice was clear and cold. "You left the boy behind," he said. "And you left me behind, too." Daniel's knees threatened to buckle. "What do you mean? I don't even know who you are." The man tilted his head. "Don't you?" The walls around them began to shimmer, their cracked surface warping like rippling water. Images emerged, scenes from Daniel's past, distorted and fragmented. He saw himself as a child, running through the woods, shouting for someone who never answered. He saw the house, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes. He saw the boy, standing alone on the porch, tears streaming down his face. And then he saw the man, only younger, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. He was shouting at Daniel, reaching for him, but Daniel turned and ran. "No," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. That's not me. It's all you," the man said. "The boy, me, every shadow you've tried to bury." The images shifted again, and Daniel saw himself as an adult, standing on the porch, the car running behind him. He saw the boy, now older, standing in the doorway, pleading with him not to leave. And he saw himself driving away, never looking back. "You left," the man said, his voice like ice. "You ran, and in doing so, you left us here, bound to this place." Daniel's chest tightened as the truth began to settle over him. The boy wasn't just familiar because of the house. The boy was him. A part of him he had abandoned, trapped in the memories he had refused to confront. And the man in the coat, he was another fragment, the guilt and fear that had festered in the years since. "What? What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the room. "We want you to remember, to stop running, to take us back." "I don't know how," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to fix this." The boy appeared beside him, his small hand reaching out to touch Daniel's arm. His touch was cold but grounding, and his voice was soft. "You can't fix it, but you can stop leaving us behind." The walls groaned again, the house trembling as the images faded. Daniel knelt on the floor, the notebook clutched to his chest, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. The man in the coat knelt beside him, his voice quieter now. "This house is your prison, Daniel. But it doesn't have to be. You can let us go, let yourself go." Daniel looked at the boy, his younger self, and then at the man. The shadows around them began to lighten, the cracks in the walls glowing faintly. "How?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. The man placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his touch heavier than the boy's, but just as steady. "Accept us. Accept what you left behind. Then, and only then, will the house let you leave." Daniel closed his eyes, the tears falling freely now. He allowed the memories to wash over him, the fear, the anger, the guilt. He let himself feel it all, the weight he had carried for so long but had refused to face. When he opened his eyes, the man and the boy were gone. The room was empty, the house silent. The notebook in his hands was blank. Daniel stood in the empty room, the silence of the house pressing against his ears. The notebook in his hands was blank now, its pages free of the desperate scrawls that had haunted him. He traced the cover with trembling fingers, unsure of what to do next. The house had stopped shifting. The oppressive weight in the air had eased, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. For the first time since he arrived, Daniel felt like the house was waiting, not to trap him, but for him to make a choice. He turned slowly, taking in the cracked walls and the faint glow of the room. The memories still lingered in his mind, clear now and undeniable. The boy, the man, the fractured pieces of himself, he had faced them, accepted them. But what came next? As he stepped back into the hallway, the floor felt sturdier beneath his feet, the air warmer. The doors were no longer endless. The hallway now stretched back to the staircase. The way out. Daniel descended cautiously, his heart pounding with every step. The house groaned faintly, as though exhaling, but it no longer felt alive. It felt tired, like it had been holding on to him for far too long. When he reached the first floor, the front door was wide open. Rain still poured outside, the muddy path glistening under the faint glow of the porch light. Daniel hesitated at the threshold. The house had held him captive in more ways than one, but now it was letting him leave. The thought should have filled him with relief, but instead, he felt a pang of sadness. He turned back to look at the ruined interior, the memories of his childhood swirling in his mind. This house wasn't just a prison. It was the place where his guilt and fear had taken root. Walking away meant leaving that behind. Finally, letting go. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, the house, the boy, or the man, maybe all of them. And then he stepped outside. The rain hit his face like a cleansing wave, washing away the grime of the house. He felt lighter with each step he took toward the muddy path. When he glanced back, the house was still there, but it seemed smaller now, less menacing. The windows no longer felt like eyes watching him. They were just empty. He walked to where his car had been, and to his surprise, it was there, the headlights dim but steady. He climbed inside, the familiar scent of the upholstery grounding him. The dashboard clock blinked to life. 12:12 a.m. Daniel's stomach tightened. That had been the time when everything started. But as he stared at the clock, the seconds ticked forward, the numbers changing. 12:13 a.m. Time was moving again. He exhaled shakily and gripped the steering wheel. When he turned the key, the engine roared to life. The GPS no longer showed a red pin or mysterious destination. It was blank, waiting for him to choose where to go. As he drove away, the rain began to lighten, the storm finally breaking. The road stretched out before him, winding through the woods and back toward the city. The oppressive darkness that had once consumed the path was gone, replaced by the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. Daniel's thoughts were heavy, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel unbearable. He had faced the pieces of himself he had buried, the parts he had tried so hard to forget. He had let go of the guilt that had anchored him to that house. But as the city lights came into view, a question lingered in his mind. Was it truly over? Weeks later, Daniel found himself back in his apartment, the hum of the city filling the background. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. He worked his rideshare shifts, ate at the same diner he always had, and went to bed at reasonable hours. Yet, the experience at the house stayed with him, vivid and unshakable. One night, as he was flipping through an old box of belongings, he found the one-eyed bear. Its button eye glinted faintly in the light, and for a moment he froze. He didn't remember bringing it back with him, but there it was, tucked away like an old friend. He picked it up, the familiar weight grounding him. The bear no longer felt like a relic of his guilt. It was a reminder of what he had faced, what he had overcome. But then, something else caught his attention. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. A new rideshare request. The name on the app made his blood run cold. Oliver. The pickup location was marked as TBD. Daniel stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He looked back at the one-eyed bear in his hands, the shadows of the past flickering at the edges of his vision, and then he made his choice. Whether he accepted the ride or declined, only Daniel would know. But in the quiet hum of the city, the echoes of the house lingered, waiting, because some journeys never truly end.